Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to come up. I've been a docent for about 5 years. I just got my 5-year pin this week, and it's a wonderful ship to be a part of. I tell people that I spent 9 months on an aircraft carrier in 1970 during the Vietnam War, the USS Shangri-La, number CBS 38, built just shortly before the Midway was built. And I learned more going through docent training about aircraft carriers than I did in 12 weeks that I did in 9 months. Because on the carrier, you eat, you sleep, you work, and you start over again. And so you don't get a chance to get around the ship. I was blessed by being fortunate enough as an intelligence officer to get to brief the captain every day. So I got to know the captain, and someday I'll tell you a story over a beer about how that worked out great for me. But the point is, I got around more than many people did, but still, going through docent training was a revelation for me in terms of every aspect of the ship you have to learn. And part of the training is your outgoing test, if you will, before you get your yellow hat, is that you have to do a 3-hour tour of the ship and basically tell the senior docent that's with you everything you know about the ship. So that's the quiz to get your yellow hat. And I like to tell this story about the docent program. There's 800 volunteers on the ship. That's one of the reasons it does so well. There's 430 docents. The average age is about 77. We have a fellow that on the 27th of November, Jack Scott, who will turn 96. He was on a destroyer off Normandy in June 6, 44, to give you some perspective on, and he still volunteers. Now, he hasn't been coming in since the pandemic, just obviously, but he is incredibly sharp. And I tell this story about the docent program because 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, I went down to check the program out. And they bring you into a room, and there's 8 things you can do as a volunteer. You can work on tying knots, you can be a docent, you can be a safety person, you can work on airplanes, a variety of things. Bottom line, they said, okay, probably 20 people in the room, and this lady said, look, if you want to become a docent, come with me. So she took us up to what we call the docent locker, which is where the docents gather morning and afternoon to get their brief before they go on assignment. And so she explained to us the responsibilities that you had to do at least 20 hours a month, and you had to go through the formal training program and all that sort of thing. And there was a gentleman sitting off to the side, hadn't said a word. And she finished her little 10-minute talk, and she turned the floor over to him, and he said, let me tell you about being a docent. He said, I've been a docent for about 4 years. And he said, the day I got my yellow hat, I was so proud of myself. And I came home and I said to my wife, honey, you know something? Today, I just finished the formal part of my training. That was 12 weeks. And one day a week for 12 weeks. And I today passed the outgoing test, got my yellow hat. That means that I'm officially a docent on the USS Midway. And what that really means is that one day a week, I'm going to be on the ship. And my wife said, could they make it 2? Now that pretty much says it all about the ship. As far as we got a lot of people that are retired. I am not retired. I'm still working full time, but most people are retired, and they need to get out of the house. And the wife, especially for the men, the wife wants them out of the house. Find something to do. So the docent program is the ultimate opportunity for people to give back, to expand their knowledge, and to share their knowledge of being in the service. Now, we have a lot of people, believe it or not, that have never been in the military. They were docents. So you don't have to be a docent. I mean, you don't have to be in the military to be a docent. So if we have anyone that'd be interested, please talk to me. We'd love to get you involved. Well, let me talk about the Midway itself. It's a remarkable story. Basically, the ship was constructed during World War II, and a lot of people say, was the ship in the war? And actually, it was supposed to be, but the war ended 1 week before the ship was commissioned. It was commissioned on the 10th of September, 1945. And the uniqueness of the Midway was, number one, prior to the Midway being built, well, let me back up. To start at World War II, the Navy had 7 aircraft carriers. And within the first year, we lost 4 of them in major battles. So we were down to 3 carriers. So the Congress appropriated money for 24 carriers to be built. They were called the Essex class carriers. Straight deck, wooden deck, and during the war, we found out that the Japanese were pretty good bombardiers. And of course, then the advent of kamikazes, where they flew the airplane right into the deck, and they would drop a bomb or fly the airplane into the deck. The deck, being wood, would succumb to the bomb or the aircraft, go into the hangar deck, many times into the munitions area below that, and did tremendous damage. So it became necessary to build a different class of carrier. And so the Midway was the first of that class, called the super carriers. And the idea was that they would build it with steel deck instead of a wooden deck. The ship I was on, the Shangri-La, had teak decks. This ship, when it was built, the Midway, had 3.5 inches of steel on the flight deck, 2 inches of steel on the hangar deck, and 2 inches of steel, two decks below, above the munitions area. Now, when it was built in 17 months, cost about $85 to $89 million to build. And when it came out of the yard, it was the largest ship in the world. It was 1,001 feet long, weighed 45,000 tons, and could not go through the Panama Canal. It was an engineering marvel, in as much as, number one, it had 2,000 compartments. In addition to the steel deck, the 2,000 compartments enabled them to be able to close off a department that might be hit by a torpedo or a bomb, so as not to sink the ship. So that was part of the uniqueness of this new superclass carrier. The Midway was the first of that class. The second ship to be built was supposed to be the Coral Sea, but President Roosevelt, as you may remember, died in April of 1945. So in his memory, they named the second ship the FDR, and then the third ship was actually the Coral Sea. So they're called the Three Sisters. That's one of the talks that I give on the carrier, is the Three Sisters talk, and basically it's talking about the evolution of these three steel deck carriers. Inside this ship, the manning level, if you will, was about 4,500 people. Now that's bigger than my hometown in Wyoming I grew up in, so it give you some perspective on how big this ship is. It truly is a city at sea, and there's an area below the hangar deck called the second deck, and that's where a lot of the things that you see in this slide is located. It had a barber shop, it had a radio station, it had a TV station, it had a water department, a sewer department, a post office. I mean, it had all the things that any town of 4,500 people would have. So it truly was a city at sea. The complement was, the average age, I would say, on the ship was probably about 19 years old, to give you some idea. These are young kids coming out of the high schools. Some of them may have gone to college for a year or so, and they came into the Navy for adventure, for training, and because they felt an obligation to the country. So it was a pretty amazing thing to see how well these young men and women, now women, but I think it's about 18% of the complement of the modern carriers and modern ships are women. But back in those days, when the Midway was around, there were no women on board. But these young men were remarkable in their ability to adapt and adjust and to take training and implement it, especially out on the flight deck where there's 200 people operating and you've got aircraft going every direction. It's one of the most dangerous places in the world to be when you were doing flight ops, because you can get blown over the side, you can be sucked into an intake, you can be run over, the cable can break and do damage to you. So there's a lot of hazard out there. And these young people work 12 and 14-hour days and do a remarkable job. So these photos give you some indication of what life's like. Guys are chipping paint, cleaning out boilers. It's a real all hands on deck and under the deck, below the deck, I should say, effort. But the teamwork and the camaraderie that is experienced on a ship is remarkable. I always marvel at it, and it really is something to behold. Now the Midway, when it was commissioned in 45, it was in Newport News, Virginia, and they stationed it at Norfolk for the first 10 years of its life. And it made many trips to the Mediterranean. But one of the things it did that was sort of unique is they sent it up to the Arctic in what they call Operation Frostbite. And it's well named because it was extremely cold. There were 25-foot seas. The pilots wore these insulated suits, and the enlisted personnel that were out on the deck were freezing to death. They weren't up there that long, but up there long enough to realize that they could actually operate in a frigid condition. And that was the whole idea behind Frostbite. One other thing they did, that was in March of 46. And in 47, they took the ship down to Bermuda, and we had captured a V2 German rocket at the end of the war. And the determination was made that we should test this rocket's capability, launch it off the ship, if you will, because we had never done that before. So Operation Sandy was all about launching this V2 rocket. And so they put it out on the back, on the stern of the ship, the aft portion of the ship, and they launched that baby, and it almost took the island out, which is this superstructure you see in the picture here. That's a whole different story, but the bottom line is they were successful in launching it. That was the beginnings of rocketry off of Navy ships. Now, all the modern carriers, all the modern destroyers and cruisers all have missile capability. Our submarines certainly have ballistic missile capability. And the ship has the in-close, what we call the Gatling gun capability, the modern carriers do, where it can fire 6,000 rounds a minute and take out incoming missiles. So the ship has the ability to defend itself. But the very beginnings of this were on the Midway in 1947 down in Bermuda when the launch of this particular missile. This hatch is an area down near if you come down to get a tour, this is down on the second deck. It's down near the post office. And basically what this area is where we had the nuclear weapons. We had about 100 people that were specialists in this area, and this area was only accessed from two directions. And we had Marine guards that stood duty 724 to keep this area secure. And you always knew who was working around the weapons because they had a special badge they wore for radiation detection. As I said, the first 10 years of its life, the ship was in the Med, and we were overflown many times by the Soviets. This airplane right here is an anti-submarine warfare plane. You can see how low he is. We played this game of chicken with them. We would fly alongside. We'd take pictures of them. They'd take pictures of us. They'd take pictures of the ship, et cetera, et cetera. So this little game went on all the time during the Cold War era. In 1955, they put the Midway, decided to put it on the West Coast. It had been in Newport for 10 years or so, from 45 to 55. So in 55, they sent it over to the West Coast to Alameda. And they came around Africa and up to the Indian Ocean and finally got there. It took a few days to do that. But as soon as they got there, they put it in the yard up in Bremerton. And the purpose of that was to put on what we call an angled deck. Now, the reason we put an angled deck on the ship is because prior to this, we had 14 resting gear cables, and we were using propeller-driven airplanes like the Wildcat and the Corsair and airplanes like that. They only came aboard about, say, like 80 or 90 knots, not that fast. So with 14 arresting gear cables, we could probably catch the airplane pretty easily. But with the advent of the jet engine, we got to a point where we had much larger, faster, bigger airplanes. And the British came up with the idea of the angled deck. And as a result of that, we were able to put this angled deck on, and it was an 11-degree angled deck. And so you could land, and we, instead of using 14 arresting gear cables, we only had to use 3, because as the airplane came down the chute, if you will, on the glide slope and tried to engage one of these cables, if they missed the cable, they went to 100% power. When we had propeller-driven airplanes, when they came aboard, as soon as they engaged the cable, they cut the power. But on the angle deck, they go to full power for the simple reason that if you miss the cable, or the cable should happen to break, you have to have enough end speed to get up and get back and fly again, get back in the pattern and try it again. So that's why we came with the angle deck. So that was done in 1955 to 57. Then the ship made several trips to Vietnam, and then in 1966, they put it into the 100 Point shipyard, which is just across from Alameda, south of San Francisco. And they put the deck that we have on there today, which is a 13-degree angle deck. So the original ship was a straight deck, steel deck, but it was steel deck, but we had 14 arresting gear cable. By the time we got finished with that 4-year alteration from 66 to 1970, which was supposed to be a 2-year evolution and cost $89 million, it cost $200 million. So they spent so much money on it, had such a cost overrun, they did not do the same modifications to the FDR and Carl said they did some of the modifications. They put angle decks on them, but they didn't do the extensive work on them that they did on the Midway. I guess I could justify the expense though, because the ship ended up serving for 47 years, far longer than the FDR and longer than the Carl C. So at the end of the day, the carrier you see today is a 4.02 acre flight deck. And when it was originally built, it was 2.8 acres. So it almost double the size. It was so big and so heavy and so top heavy, they had to put blisters on the side of the ship to counterbalance. They had put some cement in the ship to counterbalance it because it would kind of wallow through the ocean. And when you get into heavy seas, there were times when the green water would actually come over the bow. I've heard stories about that. I didn't serve on it, but the stories are pretty legendary. What you see on your screen here is one of the major evolutions that the ship is known for. In 1973, the Midway was forward stationed in Yokosuka, Japan. First time we'd ever done that. And by the way, the Reagan has been there for a number of years, but for 18 years, the Midway was forward stationed in Yokosuka. And in 1975, the ship was dispatched down to the Philippines, and we were told to remove about half of the airplanes that we had on board to make way for about 10 or 20 Air Force helicopters. We also stopped in Okinawa and brought some Marine helicopters on board that we transferred to a different ship. But the fact remains that the United States started to cut back the amount of money we were spending in Vietnam. We were spending in excess of $2 billion, a good share per year, a good share of the time that we were over there. And the determination was made that this was a sort of a futile effort. So they cut way back in 74 and in 75, even more so. And the North Vietnamese saw an opening and decided it was time to make a run on Saigon. And they did, and they made a huge run on it. And the roads were jammed around the ship. Around the Saigon area. People were racing to get away. And so the military had a heck of a time trying to get back down to Saigon to help backfill this incursion from the north and from the west, actually. So what happened was the Midway, along with the Hancock and about 20 other ships, were dispatched off of Saigon to do a rescue of the thousands and thousands of Vietnamese civilians who had been working and supporting our war effort. They were either, if we didn't rescue them, they were going to re-education camps, which is a fancy way of saying concentration camps, or they were going to be killed, one or the other. So the Midway, on the 29th and 30th of April of 1975, in a 30-hour period, we rescued 3,005 Vietnamese men, women, and children onto the Midway. And we just did this massive evacuation out of the Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base there in Saigon, and out of the embassy roof, and out of the off the roof of one of the CIA hotels there in Saigon. My wife and I were in Vietnam about a year ago, or about a year and a half ago, And we saw the embassy and we saw the hotel where they rescued him. The classic picture where you see the helicopter and people trying to climb up on that roof and get in. That was the time frame we're talking about here. The remarkable thing to me is that without any injuries, over a period of 30 hours, they rescued over 3,000 Vietnamese families. Plus, there was another 4,000 that were rescued during that same time frame that went to the Hancock and these other amphibious ships. So there was a total of 7,000 families, essentially, or 7,000 individuals rescued during that period of time. Now, the remarkable story is there was let me back up here. The remarkable story is that during this 30-hour period of time, a small airplane called an OV-1, it's a observation airplane, came flying by the ship, and he dropped a note on the deck. And here was this chaos. There were 20 or 30 helicopters coming and going constantly, kids running all over the deck, mothers and dads trying to corral their kids, people with every valuable they had stuffed into a suitcase, all over the deck. And this airplane comes by and drops a note, and the note blows away. The ship's going, the wind across the deck's about 30 knots. So the guy comes by again, drops the second note, that blows away. The third time, he kind of figured it out, puts the note inside of a leather holster and drops it on the deck. One of the enlisted personnel on the deck went out and grabbed the note, took it up to the captain, and the note said this: I have my family, my wife and 5 children in this 2-seat airplane, and I am going to ask you to clear the deck because I'm going to land. Now, Captain Chambers, now retired Rear Admiral Chambers, was the commanding officer, and he had a choice to make. He could allow this family to land in the water and drown, or he could push millions and millions of dollars worth of helicopters over the side and make a place for this man to land. And he chose the courageous, moral thing to do. And I heard him speak. My wife and I were at a dinner on the Midway about a year ago, and then Captain, now Admiral Chambers, told the story of he was actually told not to do this by his superior, but another admiral that was more senior said, do what you have to do. And so they pushed, I've forgotten the number, maybe 20 helicopters over the side to make room for this little plane to land. And he landed in about 100 feet. It was unbelievable, because the plane only would go about 80, 90 knots, 30 knots of wind facing him, touchdown, rolls out. Our personnel on the deck took the family out of the airplane, took them up to the captain. And this gentleman's name was Major Bao. He was an Army officer who stole the airplane and put his family in there. And he didn't know where the ships were. All he saw was these helicopters going back and forth out of Saigon, put 2 and 2 together and said, whatever happens is going to happen. I got to get my family out of here. So he followed the helicopters out to the ship. Bottom line is, we have a replica of that airplane, that bird dog airplane, hanging in the hangar bay of the Midway. And our skipper, Mac McLaughlin, told the story at that dinner about a couple of years ago. Now, he brought his family back to the Midway 5 or 6 years ago, and they had a big reunion, and many Vietnamese from the San Diego area came aboard. But this was a couple of years ago, and the major and his wife came back to San Diego, came aboard the Midway, and our skipper, who's a retired admiral himself, was telling the story that as they entered the hangar deck, Major Bao looked up and saw this bird dog airplane. And he started describing what it was like to bring that airplane aboard with his family, his 5 children that ranged from about 6 months to about 14 years old, and his wife on board the ship. And as they were walking towards the airplane, our skipper, all of a sudden realized that his wife wasn't there. He looked back, and his wife was on her knees in tears. The major was thinking about bringing the airplane aboard. His wife was thinking about, this ship saved my family's life. And he said that the was so emotional when he told the story, and I'm getting kind of choked up thinking about it. It was just an amazing thing that happened there, and so that's part of the wonderful legacy of the Midway. The Operation Frequent Wind story is one that I love to tell because it sort of shows such a human side to the Midway. That was in 1975. In 1990, Midway, still in Yokosuka, was tasked to go along with 3 other carriers into the Gulf War. They went inside the Gulf, and in about 45 days, the Midway was the lead carrier. Our admiral was senior, so he was the task force commander, essentially, the flagship, if you will. We launched over 3,000 sorties during that time, and we had a very successful effort. As you know, we drove Saddam out of Kuwait in a very short period of time, thanks to the leadership of President George Herbert Walker Bush. So they came back to Yokosuka. Then that was 1990. 1991, in the summer of 91, again, the Midway was dispatched down to the Philippines because Mount Pinatubo erupted. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in 100 years. And you can see this photo here. These ash buried Clark Air Force Base. And so the Midway was dispatched down there to evacuate several thousand civilians who worked for the Air Force. And they did that. They were able to get all those people out of there safely and get them away from this tremendous volcanic eruption. So in 1992, the ship was brought back to San Diego, and it was decommissioned in June of 92, and then it was towed up to Washington State, to Bremerton, and put in dry dock. And for the next 12 years, an effort was mounted by a former skipper of the ship who was a retired admiral, Admiral Mixon, and a CEO of a computer company in Savannah Beach. They and about 20 people basically for 12 years, put their own money up and fought to bring the ship down. They were being opposed by the Coastal Commission, the Port Authority, the city, the county, restaurant owners. Nobody wanted this ship. And finally, they produced a document that was 3,000 pages long. And they finally relented and allowed them to bring the ship down. And there's an old saying that, success has 1,000 fathers and failures an orphan. Well, this ship now, being the most successful maritime museum in the world, and prior to the pandemic, I'm happy to tell you that we had an average of 1.3 million people coming aboard the ship. The fact remains that it is an incredibly successful museum. Say nothing of the fact that it is a show ship of the maritime museums around the world, certainly in the United States. And we have people from the Hornet and from the Wasp and from the Intrepid and all these other ships that are in New York and San Francisco and other places, battleships. We have people coming constantly saying, what are you doing? Why are you so successful? And the what we call the Midway magic is the 800 people who volunteer down there. That is really the secret sauce, if you will, that makes the ship come alive. And we have probably 100 people that are actually paid, but we've had to lay people off, but tragically because of the COVID, we were shut from March to July, and we opened up on a partial basis. So we now have the hangar deck, flight deck, the forward loop, we call it, which is the forecastle, the combat information center, and the flag area is open. But and then later this month, we're going to open up the island, so we'll get the tours going there again. But you can't go down in the engine room. You can't go down in the second deck or third deck. But hopefully when we get the vaccine going here, then we'll be able to open it up. So if you come down, you can see a lot, but you can't see the whole thing right now. So as I said, it is an incredibly successful museum. We have our little device you pick up when you come aboard the ship. It's a self-guided tour, except for the catapult and trap briefs. some of which I do. And up on the island, you see the picture of the island in the background with a 41. That's considered the island. It's the raised portion above the flight deck. And you walk around with this little lanyard, and you walk up to an airplane. It's got a sign, and you touch the lanyard, this little device, and you're being told the story of that particular airplane by the guy that flew it. Okay, so it's a self-guided tour for the most part, other than the trap brief, the island tour, and so forth. So the docents are there to be a resource. And we really don't conduct tours per se, other than the island. But we're there to show you around, answer questions, etc. This is showing our attendance. Like I say, our numbers are way off. Normally on a normal year, we'd have 1.3 million. This year, I'm going to guess we'll maybe have maybe 25% of that. But once the vaccine is readily available, I would predict that within a year or two, we'll be back up over 1 million visitors a year, because it's such an attraction.
Yes.
Now, what we do, Mandarin, by the way, is the second most spoken language aboard the ship after English. And we have this little device in 6 different languages: Spanish, English, English, Spanish, German, Mandarin, French, and Italian, I think. There's at least 6 languages that you can set the device for, if that's your native tongue. At night, we have about 300 events a year. Corporate events, every kind of conceivable thing. We've had as many as 4,000 people at an event, at a dinner and that kind of thing. And we have at least 400 military events a year, commissionings, retirement ceremonies, memorial services, promotion ceremonies, et cetera, et cetera. So this ship is utilized. We have an education program where we bring on 50,000 kids a year to Midway University, and we teach them the STEM program, science, engineering, mathematics, and we teach them patriotism, and we teach them what it is to be an American citizen. So, and the program is sold out. The schools, we pay to have the kids transported from the schools to the museum. And these kids come and they love it, and they are our greatest ambassadors. It's also been used as a set for American Idol, for a variety of different shows. The Bachelor, National Geographic has done shows from there. A number of channels like National Geographic have utilized the ship as a backdrop. So if anyone is interested in volunteering, there's all kinds of things that you can do. You can be a docent, you can work on ships, you can work in the library, you can tie knots. Our knot tying program is pretty unique. We make these little devices like this. It's called a monkey fist. I use it for my keys. And they have bracelets. Believe it or not, well-kept secret, but we have about 40 people that tie knots, and then they sell them on the weekends. That program brings $100,000 a year into the ship.
Wow.
It's just amazing what innovation is there. We make a lot of donations to first responders, local active duty people, firefighters, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a very active foundation that donates money every year, and we match dollars that are donated to the ship. It's the best deal in town. For an adult now, the price is $26. I mean, you can't go to SeaWorld, you can't go to the zoo, you can't go anywhere. You can take a family of 4 easily on the ship for under $100, and you can spend 5, 6, 7 hours there. It's an all-day event. So I defy you to find a more entertaining and educational experience than coming aboard the Midway, and it's much less for the children, and kids under 5 are free. And so, and if you folks will come down, I'll give you a free tour. So that's the Midway in a nutshell. Now, what I'd like to do at this point, for the next few minutes, is take any questions that you might have about the ship, about anything I've said, anything that I could answer. I'd be more than happy to. So
yes, please unmute yourselves. I would like to put a request. I would like to have my demotion.
Sure. You got
At the Midway.
Yeah, right. You just have to book it enough in advance, to let them know. So.
Does anybody have questions for Terry?
I've got one.
Yes, sir.
How many propellers did the Midway have, and are they still in place?
They are. They weigh 20 tons each, and they had four. Four, yeah. And there's 4 engine rooms, and the ship is driven by steam. And it's a little. We used diesel fuel marine as a energizer for to create the heat, to create the steam to drive the ship. So steam heated the ship, steam drove the catapults, and steam drove the ship. Okay, and each of those engine rooms has a shaft coming out of it to those four propellers. Screws is the formal name, and depending on where they are, the shafts are anywhere from like 250 to 400 feet long. And it's interesting because the screws are different sizes, and they turn. The outside ones turn at slightly a different opposite the inside ones to keep the cavitation effect down. So it's a very interesting dynamic that goes on. But yes, the screws actually will sit on the bottom. As the tide goes out, the ship. A lot of people don't know, but the ship is floating there. It's not anchored. It's anchored, but it's not. So it goes up and down, and so those screws sometimes will sit on the silt bottom of San Diego Harbor. Okay.
It's got to be shallow there.
It is, and so what they do is once a year or a year and a half, we pay a lot of money to have the bottom scrubbed to preserve the ship, and we have a phenomenal engineering officer. He was a 20-some year veteran, came to the ship a couple of years ago as a chief engineering officer, and he's unbelievably talented at keeping the ship. One of the things we embarked on recently was an effort to replace the cables on the three elevators. That was $2 million per elevator.
Wow.
Because you have to have all these elevators operating, because every night we're bringing on all this equipment, food and so forth to cater. And someone way back when the ship opened, the ship's been open 16 years as of this past June. Some wise soul realized that the best thing we could do was get a liquor license. So when we serve liquor on the ship benefits. So that's a great revenue source for the ship as well. It is run like a Swiss watch. The CEO is a retired admiral. He was a helicopter pilot. And if you went to Central Casting and asked for a guy who was nice looking, well dressed, in good shape, and had a smile that would light up the world, Mac McLaughlin would be brought out. He is absolutely incredible. And I tell the story, one of my good friends that spent about, I've forgotten, 9-10 months at sea. And they were at sea for 100 days straight. He was the backseater in an F-4 during Vietnam. And he and his wife came over from Arizona. My wife and I took them aboard the ship. And we'd been aboard 2 or 3 hours. And I was telling him about our skipper, about Mac, our CEO. And we're walking down the hangar deck on the way out. And I spotted Mac coming towards me. He was walking along with someone, as he always is. And I said, Mac, do you have a minute? He immediately came over. I introduced him to my friend Harry and his wife, and told him that Harry was a backseater and had 102 missions and so forth and so on. And Mac made my friend feel like he was the only person in the world. In 2 minutes, he charmed my friend like you can't believe. That's Mac. That's just who he is. And he's such a visionary, and he has such a great board of directors. We have a retired female admiral that was the consultant to the mayor of San Diego. She was in charge of the Red Cross. I mean, this woman has done everything. She's on the board. That's the kind of talent we have on the board of the Midway. And they are such visionaries. They are constantly improving the ship. We put this museum, we put this theater in a few years ago. It's a 17-minute movie that tells the story of a squadron that lost virtually every pilot during the Battle of Midway except one. And we have a virtual reality, and he comes out on the stage. I mean, it's a phenomenal story. Because, the Battle of Midway was so unique because we sank 4 Japanese carriers in a matter of minutes. It was the turning point in World War II. That is why this ship was named the Midway. Another little anecdote that I will share. The Midway was already a ship when they built this ship. But because of the Battle of Midway and because of the notoriety of that battle, they wanted to name this new supercarrier the Midway. But here we had a carrier escort, which is a smaller version of a carrier, that already had the name Midway. So the determination was made to take that name and give it to this new modern ship. The only problem with that is that there is a legacy that says if you rename a ship, it's bad luck. So they renamed the ship. They took the name Midway and gave it to this new modern ship that was coming out. And the ship that had been named the Midway, they named it the St. Lo. 2 weeks after they changed the name, it was sunk by a kamikaze in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So I just found that story out recently. That was fascinating to me. But nonetheless, that is the story of the Midway, and the fact that it served 47 years and did all the unique things it did is what makes it such a legacy. Has such a legacy, and what we're trying to do as volunteers is just perpetuate that legacy, educate the public about what a wonderful place it is to visit, and they do 4th of July events, they do veterans events. When the ship can open up again, we will have, thousands of people coming aboard. I mean, I was there, the first year I was on board was 2016. I started in 2015 in the fall, and 2016 was the first full year I was there. And I was there in December during the Holiday Bowl. And there were a lot of people in town. I was there for the 2 biggest days in the history of the Midway. One day we had like 8,600 people. And one day, a couple of days later, we had 9,400 people on the ship. I mean, that's probably, the fire marshal, I think, was freaking out probably, but the fact remains that that was, to give you some indication of the popularity, because there were people in town and it was a good deal and it was inexpensive. You could take a whole family on board. So it made a lot of sense for people who are looking for things to do, right? So, any other questions I can answer?
Any other questions for Terry? Speak up before we move on.
I was going to ask you, you said that during Operation Frostbite, that
Yeah.
you had 25, or the ship had 25-foot seas.
Right.
When I was on the Bonhammer Shark, we had 12-foot seas, and we had launched helicopters.
Right.
Like, were they able to? What is
I'm not sure.
sea level?
I'm not sure that they actually launched, John, during that time, but they encountered some 25-foot seas when they were up in the Arctic area. Okay. Now I was on the Shangri-La, and we left Mayport on the 5th of March, 1970. Went to Rio for a few days, and then went around the tip of Africa, up to the Indian Ocean on the way to the Philippines to Vietnam. And we got in between 2 typhoons, not 1, but 2. And we had 18 tie-down chains on the airplanes. The airplanes that we couldn't get on the hangar deck, we put them in a pack down the middle of the flight deck, 18 tie-down chains on each one of them. And I went out from time to time this went on for days, and the deck was moving. This is a 45,000 ton aircraft carrier. The deck was moving between 11 and 18 feet. The spray was breaking over the bow. The bow was 50 feet off the water. The spray was breaking over it took the catwalks off the side of the ship. I mean, I've never seen, I gained an appreciation for nature that I've never had before. I mean, it was absolutely unbelievable. And right in the middle of this, our skipper said, these airplanes are bleeding hydraulic fluid because they hadn't flown them. Launch them. So we did. We launched them. And I was just talking on the way up here today. One of my best friends was an F-8 pilot in our squadron. I was in a photo squadron. And we were talking about that day when they launched him, and the first A4 came in and blew all 3 tires because he was coming down when the ship was coming up. The second guy, the same thing. They drug him out of the middle of the deck so they could make room for the next guy to come in. The second guy did the same thing. And when my friend Doug landed, he played it just right and didn't break the airplane, didn't blow the tires, and got aboard safely. And I said, just skill and daring. He said, a lot of luck, really, because that ship was moving like you could not believe. Now the Fresnel lens, which is the system that we use to bring planes aboard, it puts a beam of light after the ship, 3/4 of a mile at 3.5 degrees. That's the glide slope they fly down. It is gyro stabilized to 6 degrees. So if the ship is moving, it does a pretty good job of providing a stable platform for them to fly down in terms of a visual. But even so, when you're moving 11 to 18 feet, forget it. It's just luck of the draw if you get aboard safely. It was wild. I remember that day like it was yesterday. And I was telling him that, and he said, yeah, he said, I was he was a very skilled pilot, but he said I was also very lucky. And I remember the maintenance chief being so thrilled that he didn't break the airplane. Because my friend was kind of a wild man. He was a great pilot, but he was a daredevil at heart, and he did all kinds of wild things I won't tell you about. But he lived to tell about it, fortunately.
You can tell us next time.
Yeah, exactly. When you come down to the ship, I'll tell you more about it. So. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. He's retired long since, and he's out of harm's way, and I won't tell you where he lives. So.
Anyone else have a question for Terry? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I had a question. I don't know if it's.
Can you hear James? I can't hear James.
I can't hear him.
Can you hear me now?
1 second. We can't hear you, James. Do you want to?
Can you repeat it, John? Can you repeat it now?
How about now? Can you hear me okay?
One second, James.
Okay.
I can hear you from my computer, and Terry can't hear you.
I can't hear you.
From his computer either. We'll try John's. Unmute yourself, John.
Still no luck? Try.
Well, Pajanga doesn't have a golf tournament today, so we're good.
Okay, any luck now?
Can you hear me?
I can't.
That's really
If
weird.
you could repeat it.
I can hear you. It's just very, very quiet and soft. So if you could move your microphone closer, maybe.
I can try it. This a little bit better?
There you go. That's it. Now we can hear it.
Okay.
It's
Oh,
better.
how weird. Okay, I was just going to say, I don't know if it's a kind of a silly question or not, but I was curious if
I can't
if
even
the Midway,
fade it out.
yeah, if the Midway or other ships that are now museums are how
Can you hear him,
close
John?
are they to, if they needed to be brought into service, could they be, or not really? Are they just completely that's all they could be now is museums?
Can ships be brought in to be serviced? Now, if they're turned into museums.
Service in what regard?
I mean, could they be, say, if they were needed for some military operation, could they be brought back in?
Purpose.
Oh,
Service.
No, because once they're put into mothballs, well, that's not true. The New Jersey, the battleship New Jersey was put in mothballs and then brought out during the Vietnam era and then put back in mothballs. So the answer is yes, but it's very rare to do it because what happens is as we build new ships, we retire the old ones. For example, the newest carrier is the Gerald Ford, number 78, came out about 2.5 years ago. Hopefully by the end of the year, it will be fully integrated in the fleet. It's unique because it has electromagnetic catapults instead of steam catapults. That's a whole new deal, a whole new arresting gear system. And it's so high tech that they can get by with about 4,000 people instead of 4,500.
Wow.
So to give you some contrast, When the Midway was built, it cost about $89 million. The Gerald Ford, which came out 2.5 years ago, cost 12.5 billion. Okay, so the Ford is out, 78. The Kennedy is being built right now, 79, and the Enterprise number 80 will be constructed. And then the unique thing is they just announced recently that the newest one to be built after that is called the Dory Miller. Dory Miller was an enlisted cook in Pearl Harbor. It did some very heroic things. And my wife actually teaches at Miller Elementary School. She teaches children that are struggling to read. And it's a school for kids that are in the military. I mean, it's dependent, Navy and Marine Corps dependents down in Sarasota area, San Diego. And it's named for Dory Miller. And they are going to name a carrier after, it's the first time in history that enlisted persons had their name on a carrier. It's usually presidents and, Teddy Roosevelt, the Gerald Ford, the George Bush, or a congressman that appropriated the money, Stennis and people like that. That's usually who they name ships after. But I think it's such a phenomenal thing that they're going to name number 81, yes, after Dory Miller, which is very fitting because this man was a real hero.
Wow.
So what happens is when you bring a new carrier on, typically you usually have about 11 carriers, so they'll retire one. So like they'll retire the Nimitz, will probably go away and go into retirement. Now what's unique is that the Shangri-La, which I was on, is actually off Taiwan. It's a fishing reef, okay, because it had teak decks. But the modern carriers are all nuclear powered, and you don't put nuclear power plants in the water. You just don't do that for obvious reasons, okay? So modern carriers don't normally end up as museums. Is the problem? Is because of the nuclear reactor.
Did that answer your question, James? And a little bit more.
Yeah, probably more than you want to know.
Anyone else have a question for Terry?
Now, on the bottom of the chart, the steering wheel wasn't as big as I thought. How big is the steering wheel on?
Really big. Yeah,
It is big?
really big. In fact, I was on the Zoom vault. It's about the size of a quarter. It's it's like a video game. It's keyboard and it's incredible. I mean, it's just, here's this stealth ship that's about 600 feet long, and it has the radar profile of a small fishing boat. Because it's so stealth, the way they've painted it and the angles and everything. The radar reflection is like a small fishing boat, and it's actually 600 feet long. But it's such an amazing ship to be on. We went on it as docents. We went on it about a year ago, and we're up there on the bridge, and you can barely see out of it. There's a bunch of little small windows, and here, the helm is this little tiny, it's about the size of a quarter, like a joystick almost. I'm like, you got to be kidding me, because the Midways is, it's a good size helm, So.
I was there, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago.
Right. It's been
But
open
we
16
didn't
years.
finish. We didn't finish the tour.
Oh yeah, it takes a long time. You're going to see everything. It'll take a couple days if you really want to see
And
everything.
when you were saying as volunteers for, there's multiple areas, and in
Right.
regards to the nodding, I have some bracelets and I have
Right.
some keychains too
Right.
that I bought. They were actually making them
Oh yeah,
there.
yeah, they do. Yeah.
And I will volunteer my husband as soon as he retires because he's great at doing nods.
Great. Well, they have like
He's
40
a
people.
fisherman.
Oh, like,
Yes.
perfect. They're loving guys like that. I mean,
And-
seriously,
and-
guys and ladies we have a lot of ladies that do it too.
Yes.
They're very nimble fingered. My
And-
wife's a seamstress, and
He had the highest, what's the, for Boy Scout?
oh yeah,
Was it
so yeah,
Eagle Scout? Yes.
Eagle Scout. Yeah,
So
I was an
he's
Eagle
good at
Scout.
nodding.
Yeah. I
Doing
was
nods. He goes, oh, I know how to do that.
bowling on a bite and a sheep shank with a square knot in the middle and all that kind of stuff. I can't do them, but I remember the names. So, yeah, I was a Boy Scout and an Eagle Scout back in the
So
day.
as soon as he retires, a couple of
Well,
years.
send him down. We would
we'll
love to
send
have
him
him.
down.
Send him down. We have people that come out of the Bay Area. They come down. There's a guy that was there this weekend. He lives up in Carmel, and he comes down and does his like a week long. He's there every day for a week, gets his hours in, and then he comes down once a quarter. We have a guy from up in Nevada comes down once a quarter. Yeah. So there's, you know, when I was in the reserves, our skipper, Pat Thompson got the record. He flew in from London for drill weekends.
Wow.
He was an airline pilot, and he was living in London. And he flew in for the, you know, for his drill weekend. So we have people coming from all over the place.
Great. I do have a question. Your pins.
Yes.
The meaning.
Well, the one, the little is a Phantom. Okay, I was blessed in my reserve duty.
Can you turn a little bit to the camera so
Sure,
they can
I'm
see
sorry.
it?
Can you see it?
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
This is symbolic of the F-4 Phantom, which was a Vietnam era twin engine jet airplane. And when I first got to the squadron at Miramar as a reserve intelligence officer, we had the F-8, which is a single seat airplane. And almost as soon as I got there, they transitioned to the F-4, which is a two-seat airplane. So I went through the training, the familiarization training for a week. And you learn about the systems and you learn about all kinds of stuff. And I got my flight suit and my boots and my helmet. And every time there was a back seat open, I flew. So I have about, I don't know, 10 or 15 hours in the back of the Phantom. And I did drop live ordnance, did cross countries, refueled, did everything except trap. I wanted to trap, but we were out in November of 1976 on the Ranger off of San Diego. And this was a test of the capability of a reserve air wing to go on an active duty ship and perform. The Pentagon wanted to see if they could call up the reserve and see how they perform. Truth be known, the best pilots in the Navy were in the reserve squadrons. Guys that had 2 tours of NOM, 200 traps, thousands and thousands of hours of flight time, who were flying for the airlines, and they were flying for fun in the reserve. They were the best pilots the Navy had. So we didn't just pass the test, we maxed the test. We outperformed the active Navy, because the active Navy had a lot of young rookie pilots, you know, that were just learning how to fly. Our guys were veterans. I mean, these guys were best of the best, seriously. We had old airplanes, but they could fly. And so we went out there for 10 days and did this air wing test. And I really wanted to trap and stuff, but we had the Assistant Secretary of Defense for this, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for that. And we had captains carrying coffee for people. There was so much brass aboard the ship for those 10 days for this inspection. Everybody wanted to see what these reservists could do. Well, we showed them in spades what we could do. You know, there was no question about it. My buddy Harry that I was talking about earlier, that was a backseater, he and I were part of the intelligence team, briefing and debriefing the flight crews. And we got I think a 98 score out of 100 or something on our part. So it was really fun.
Yes.
The tragedy was that the executive officer of Harry's squadron, who was an American airline pilot, about the last day we were out there, he was in charge of the fly off. And the fly off was, we're going to fly off all 60 airplanes that were on the carrier, form them up and fly them by the ship, and then take, you know, go to mainland and then bring the ship in. You know, everybody would fly off. Okay, it's called a fly off. That's what happens when you come back from cruise. You fly off, right? And you go back to your base, wherever your base is. Well, these guys were going to fly off, and he was in charge of the fly off. And so he was working 20-hour days. And I remember talking to this gentleman 2 hours before he went on a flight. And I said, Exo, is there anything I can do to help? He said, no. He said, we're just trying to make sure that we got everything buttoned down, everything safe. About 8 o'clock at night, bad night, rainy, windy, took off. Immediately lost his radio. They brought him back around the land, and he touched down, hit the ramp, punched out, had a good shoot. And the helo, for some reason, was way off the side of the ship. Normally, it's right there. It's right by the ship when we're launching recovery. But for some reason, he was a couple miles away. Came over, they put a diver in the water, grabbed his chute, couldn't hold the chute. And tragically, they found his body 3 days later.
Oh, boy.
Married, couple kids. And what they figured out when they finally did the inspection and the crash report, it was an A7 airplane he was in. And in the A7, instead of the canopy flying off when you punch out, there's a couple things on the back of the seat, the ejection seat, that punch a hole in the canopy as you go out. But if you fly in the full up position, your head becomes the canopy breaker. And they had put out a notice, but it was a bad night. The guy was kind of short, and he had the seat in the full up position where he could see better. And that's what they figured actually happened. That was, you know, it was just absolutely tragic. Because here was this phenomenal exercise where everybody was excelling, and it was such a downer. I just remember they had a memorial service for him on the ship, and it was, everybody was so bummed out. I mean, it was just absolutely tragic.
And the second one to your left. Quick.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the second one I just got this week, as a matter of fact. That's my 5-year docent pin for having been a volunteer for 5 years. Yeah.
Nice, nice.
So you get a jacket, a beautiful leather jacket like this when you get 1,000 hours, and then there's another jacket you get when you get 2,000 hours. So they don't pay you, but they give you
Volunteer hours.
yeah, I mean,
Yes.
recognition, right, exactly.
That's great.
Right, so
Great. Before we move on, we're almost hitting our mark
yeah,
to end
I
our.
really have to
our
go to.
time.
I've got another meeting I have to be at, so I'm gonna
Okay,
have to dash.
well, before you leave it, if anybody, no one else has any questions, let's give Terry a big applause. Thank you so much, Terry.
Thank you so much for having me.